Peglin is a Pachinko Roguelike deck builder, where you play as this thing. You throw orbs down a pit, and the more pegs you bounce into, the more damage you will deal. And in order to 100% this game, I'll have to beat every single boss, buy out entire storefronts, deal over 9,000 damage, and even beat the hardest difficulty, which apparently no one has been able to do yet. So join me in what I'm going to convince myself of as the very first time anyone has ever 100% Peglin. In Peglin, as with most other roguelikes, beating the game once, it's not really the point. After getting a successful win, you unlock a harder difficulty, and after beating that, you can unlock an even harder difficulty, with the highest difficulty being level 20, which is the achievement that no one has been able to get yet. So I think our best course of action is to start working our way there, and to try and unlock as many achievements as we can along the way. Throughout Peglin, there are a handful of achievements that will just happen naturally, things such as dealing the exact amount of damage needed to defeat an enemy, or dealing 1 damage. After enough orbs have flown down the board, we will get these with no problem. And then there will also be some achievements that need a specific build to get, such as the multi-baller achievement, where we have to have 16 orbs on the screen at once. And thanks to the Matryorbshka, which will split up into multiple orbs at once, and the duplication station, which splits those orbs up even further, with both of those combined, we can get all 16 orbs that we need. While traversing through Peglin, there are a handful of enemies that we can face. There are normal fights, such as these little slimes, which will allow us to collect some money, upgrade our orbs, and even purchase new ones. Then there are elite monsters like the Minotaur we just faced, and this big slime mama, which do the same thing as the normal encounters, except on top of all of the normal things, we can also unlock a relic, which are extremely important in completing any run in Peglin, especially when facing off against the higher difficulties. The next potential achievement is one that is quite hard to pull off, but involves getting a random tree encounter. We then shake the tree and add an egg to our bag. The egg in Peglin, it's technically an orb, but it only has one use the entire game, and it is just meant to be a one-time heal. But the achievement Extravaganza can only be unlocked if we win a run with 2 eggs in our bag. So every time we encounter the egg, we're going to add it to our bag and hope that we can eventually duplicate it and end a run with both of them. And after grabbing the egg, we make our way to the first boss. In Peglin, there are 3 total zones: the forest, castle, and the mines, each of which have 3 bosses, making for 9 total bosses in the game, which are all achievements. And the first one we face off against is Leshy, which in my opinion, even though it's the first zone of the game, is probably the hardest boss we will ever have to face. Every turn, Leshy will alternate between 2 different moves. One turn, she will deal 6 damage to you, and the next turn, she will place down 2 vines on the board. When throwing an orb, it can hit a peg that the vine is connected to in order to break the vine, or if it touches the vine itself, we will take damage as well as get our orb stuck, which will end our turn. Since this is the very first difficulty, Leshy isn't too big of a problem. But the vines that get placed down every other turn can ramp up extremely quickly and can very easily overwhelm us, and since it is only the first zone, most builds don't have that many ways of healing, if any. So every single time an orb will get stuck in a vine, it is more damage that stacks up. But thankfully, with the use of the Matryorbshka, I am able to take down the first boss and gain the achievement for defeating Leshy. The next zone in Peglin is the castle, which contains a lot of knights, archers, mages, and can be extremely tricky to navigate unless we have ways of doing damage to multiple enemies. Bombs, which damage all enemies when thrown, or pierce orbs, which damage all enemies, are extremely strong at defeating the castle, as most normal fights consist of knights with shields in front of archers and mages in the back, which can damage us at any distance. But thanks to orbs like the Bold Orb, which have pierce, it can make the castle so much easier. We also run into an encounter to duplicate our egg, which now means that the Extravaganza achievement is possible. All we have to do is win this run and not throw our egg, which will only be an issue if we get them back to back and can't discard one. The castle boss we face off against first is the Demon Wall, which does not do any damage, but instead will slowly walk towards us, and once it is within melee range, will swallow us and end our run. And luckily for us, just after getting our second egg, we do have it back to back. So not only do we have to defeat the wall in a limited number of turns, if we can't beat it before we get to our eggs, our chances of the Extravaganza are all over. But thank goodness we are just in our first run and the wall doesn't have that much health yet and isn't really an issue. We then head to the mines, which is the final zone in Peglin and also the most dangerous. Of all the enemies, they have extremely high health, can do a ton of damage, and each board has something that can make it really frustrating. And typically, if our build is strong enough, we just want to avoid as many fights as we can, as after beating the boss of the mines, our run is over. The first boss we face in the mines is the Super Sapper, which has a strong strategy around throwing bombs, and can be quite tricky to defeat, especially if we haven't found any healing yet. But luckily for us, we have the Meat Bone, which will heal us every reload, and the Crystal, which can steal life from any opponent that we want. And with that, our very first run is over. We already have 6 achievements, with one of them being the Extravaganza, which is already one of the hardest ones to get. After completing our first run, the Crucible is now unlocked, and with each level of the Crucible comes increased difficulty, with the first level already making things a bit more difficult. It gives us an extra peb ball, as well as making them weaker on any crit they get. But in Crucible 1, we get a good run going with the Swoltorb, which will increase the damage of every single peg it hits. And we go up against the Slime boss, which places slime all over the board and continuously attacks us every turn until it eventually sucks us up in an attempt to do even more damage. The next boss is in the castle, and it's the Pigment of Imagination, which is quite strange. The way this boss works is that every other turn, if it can, it will create paintings, which each turn, the pegs below them into permanent pegs, meaning that no matter how many times they are hit, they will never break. And the only way to make these pegs normal again is to destroy the paintings. The only catch is that the paintings, when destroyed, will poison us. But it's not a problem at all, because permanent pegs, they aren't annoying to deal with, so we can just ignore the paintings altogether and just attack the boss and win pretty easily. The mine boss for this run is Thesaurus the Avaricious Dragon. Yes, that's the name, which it can be quite difficult to deal with. This boss has a giant mound of golden pegs that it is trying to protect, and after a few turns it will try to suck us in by making one of the pits at the bottom of the board pull our orbs towards it. Thesaurus the Avaricious Dragon will then start to breathe fire, which will not only damage us, but also set some of its own pegs on fire, which will deal damage whenever they are hit. But thanks to the oboe, which reduces all damage by 1, and the fire doing only 1 damage at a time, this boss isn't a problem at all. In this game, all of the bosses, they check for some specific strategy that can easily beat it. The wall, for example, doesn't care if we have healing, and just requires us to be able to dish out a ton of damage. But Thesaurus the Avaricious Dragon can equally dish out a lot of damage, but instead can be beaten very easily with healing. This isn't the only way to beat these bosses, but as things start to ramp up in the Crucible, being able to have things in our build to counter very specific bosses and even elites later on is the best way to win in high up Crucibles. But as we are still in Crucible 1, most builds can just win. In Crucible 2, we go up against the Mole boss, which is the final of the 3 forest bosses that we have to beat, and in my opinion, it's probably the easiest. The main mechanic with the Mole boss is that it hides behind a tree, which has a massive amount of health. Then every third turn it will dig underground, allowing us 1 turn to attack it as well as it to attack us for a decent amount of damage. Typically the best way to deal with the mole is to set up our strongest orb when it is on our side of the tree, or by using things such as bombs or pierce in order to damage the mole even when it is being protected. But since there is an achievement to destroy the tree while facing off against the mole, all of those strategies don't really matter, since we have to defeat both the mole and the tree in order to get the achievement. Another achievement that happens naturally when playing the game is the achievement to leave an opponent at 1 health point, and normally it isn't worth trying to play around, as after doing a couple of runs, we'll get it. The next achievement I went for was to have an orb bounce only between slime pegs 7 times before touching anything else, and all I needed to do was to add as many ways to produce slime in my deck and just hope they would hit 7 in a row at some point. But by going for this achievement, I realized that slime might be one of the strongest things in this game, and could potentially be one of the builds that I go for when going for the higher up Crucible levels, and will soon prove to be a very consistent build at going against just about every boss in the game. There's an extremely annoying elite in the mines named Pegta, which starts the round off with only refresh and crit pegs on the board, but every time one is hit, more pegs will be added and can be an extremely difficult elite to go up against. Most throws will only hit 1 or 2 pegs for the first handful of throws, allowing for Pegta to dish out a ton of damage. But one good thing about this fight is that the achievement to deal 1 damage can be done fairly easily, just by hitting 1 peg with a weak orb and it immediately flying down to the bottom. In Peglin, there are a handful of status effects, which can be given through the use of orbs and relics. You have Spinfection, which is basically poison, Ball Work, which is shield, and Bram Ball, which will hold enemies in place. and there are some achievements that revolve around these status effects, with one of them being to gain a total of 100 or more ball work in a single battle. Of all the ways to gain armor in this game, the Buckle Orb is one of the most consistent. At max level, every 10 pegs it hits, we will gain 4 ball work, which typically isn't enough on its own to get us to 100, as every time an enemy damages us, some of that shield will go away. But when going up against the wall who never deals damage until it tries to swallow us, it can be pretty easy to build up 100 shield. Just winning the fight after doing that is going to be the hard part. Another achievement that is going to get more difficult as the Crucible levels go on is to defeat any boss on the first turn. And in this run we have a really strong bomb build going, and with the use of Sapper Sack, which turns all of our bombs into red bombs and makes them deal 300 damage apiece, and the Bombulet, which doubles all bombs on the board, when going up against the final boss, the entire board is basically red bombs, and by hitting enough, we are able to do enough damage to win in a single turn, as well as finish off Crucible 5. Trying to knock out a couple of extra achievements, I decided to clear out an entire pegboard, and then once unlocking the Cristomalos Fleece, I started working towards the Critical Thinking achievement. The Cristomalos Fleece, whenever a crit is triggered, will give us additional crit based on the crit and regular value of our orb that is thrown. And by having multiple crit pegs on the board, this value can be increased even further. And after triggering a total of 5 crits in a single turn, we are able to get the achievement with the Fleece. I eventually went up against the third and final castle boss, which is the Ballista, which is probably the hardest boss in the castle. The Ballista militia will take a decent amount of turns to load up its ballista, but one shot will deal 30 damage and confuse us for 2 turns. And if we enter this boss fight with 60 or less health, we have to defeat the Ballista before its second shot goes off, which can prove to be very difficult, especially when minions spawn every single turn and can block any non-piercing shot that is sent the boss's way. There is also an achievement to defeat every single one of the Ballista minions before defeating the boss, but it's pretty difficult to do as we'll have to stay alive for 4 or even 5 potential Ballista shots, and it will typically require a decent amount of healing or damage reduction in order to pull off, which sadly we weren't able to do in this attempt, but hopefully can later on in the Crucible, as healing builds are more important to have to survive any amount of time. I then started working my way through the Crucibles. I beat Crucible 10 for another achievement, and then I had a good run going on Crucible 13, where we gained the Balectrum, which is one of the best ways to make money in this game. Whenever entering this encounter, we can trade all of the money we currently have in order to gain the Balectrum, which essentially gives us money for every 3 pegs we hit. And for the achievement to buy out an entire shop, we're going to need at least 300 gold in order to gain that. The other really difficult part about this achievement is we can only unlock it on Crucible 10 or higher, which at this point it is harder to gain money, and we are more than likely going to be spending a lot more on healing as well as most prior shops in order to just be alive by the time we would even have 300 gold to purchase out an entire shop. But thanks to having the Balectrum, we gained up enough money and were able to buy out the shop right before the final boss, which just so happens to be the first time we encountered the QR code. This boss is separated into 4 distinct parts, which each need to be defeated in order to win, and every time a piece is destroyed, the ones that are remaining start to deal even more damage. In this run, I had a strong poison build going where every bomb that exploded will add 1 poison, and thanks to this board having a ton of bombs, we were able to get the achievement for inflicting 40 Spinfection on an opponent, as well as defeating the QR code for the first time. At this point, the Crucible levels are getting extremely difficult, with each level adding yet another form of difficulty. Only very specific builds are able to take it all the way, especially if the harder to face bosses and elites show up in any of our runs. And to note some of the more difficult modifiers in the Crucible, here are just a few of the really bad ones. We have to start our run with an additional Peball, and all of our Pebballs are weaker. There is only 1 refresh peg as well as 1 crit peg. All enemies have increased health. We start our turn with a Terra Ball, which does 1 damage and can never be upgraded. We no longer full heal after boss fights. We start with 85 health instead of 100, and enemies take an additional turn while reloading, among all the other debuffs, as well as the worst 5 still to come while working towards Crucible 20. In Crucible 16, we now have to start our run with a Horror Ball, which deals 0 damage and can never be removed from our deck, which is so much worse than the Terra Ball, and with both of them being in our deck, sometimes even with the discards, we will still have to use them. When playing in Crucible 16 and beyond, there are a few bosses and elites that are basically run enders. As mentioned before, Leshy in the forest is almost impossible to beat when close to Crucible 20. The damage that Leshy does and the amount of vines that are placed on the board reduce the damage that we are able to do drastically. And thanks to having less strong orbs as well as Leshy having much more health, this fight almost always ends up in a loss. Other than Leshy, the biggest issue I faced in the higher up Crucible levels was Peg Time, which was the one that starts off each round with only one peg on the board. And when healing is reduced so much, our total health is so low and more of our orbs don't do any damage, the amount of life we lose before being able to build up a board against Pegta either will just end the run right there or will cause us to lose in the next couple of rounds due to lack of health. And that's not to say that all of the other fights are easy, it's just that these two are almost certain losses, where all of the other ones I have a slim chance of being able to make it past. And if I'm not able to get a strong build going, then most of the time I will just lose to a random enemy by slowly losing health each round. As far as the builds that are the strongest in the later Crucibles, I found there are a few combos that always had a solid chance of winning or at least going pretty far. The main one was building around slimes, or refreshes, or healing and defense, all of which have a decent amount of healing, and it really proves that in the later rounds, as long as we can out-heal any damage done by our opponent, our offense doesn't really matter unless we're up against the wall. And that is not to say that there aren't other builds that can win. In Crucible 16, I was able to get the Orboros, which will continually increase its own damage after every throw, and when combined with the Lucky Chip, which can 2 times our damage, if we land it in the right slot, each throw can double in power, eventually leading to some massive damage, which also gave us the achievement for dealing over 9,000 damage in a single throw. Crucible 19 then added additional enemies to every single fight, and just made the chance of losing each round, as well as just losing additional health each round, all that more likely. But with a really strong combo of the Sash of Focus, which prevents death once, and then halves all incoming damage after the fact, and the Oboe, which reduces damage by 1 after that half is accounted for, we were able to tank just about any opponent we went up against, with the final boss not even being able to damage us. And that leads us to our final Crucible, which is going to almost always require a little bit of slime in order to win. Crucible 20 adds the additional modifier to make every boss have a unique attribute that makes it much stronger, meaning that we are going to have to be on our A game before the end of every single zone, as well as risking as many elite fights as we can in order to make our build as strong as possible. I had about 20 attempts at Crucible 20, and up until this point, only 2 of those even made it past the forest, and I was quickly learning that the very few relics we were able to get at the beginning were going to be extremely important. And with the free relic we were able to start with in this run, we were able to get the Round Guard, which is probably one of the best starting relics to have. Thanks to being in Crucible 20, one of the modifiers along the way allows for our opponents to have 2 additional turns while we are reloading, meaning that whenever we have to reload our orbs, the opponent will get 3 total turns, which typically it always ends up in a loss. But with the Round Guard making us immune to damage during our reload, we can take a lot more time to win our rounds, as reloading isn't an instant loss for us anymore. Then after our very first fight, we found a treasure chest, which has a fantastic relic for our beloved slime build that we are going to be working towards, called a Good Slime. This relic makes it so whenever a slime is applied to a peg, that peg will gain an additional 5 damage every time it is hit. And if we are able to get enough slimes later on, it will allow us to focus more on healing and staying alive, since this damage can stack up fairly quickly. Another thing that is important in Peglin is gathering money early on so that we can afford the orbs and healing that we need. Every time we hit a money peg, we will gain 1 gold, and since the early fights are the easiest to survive in, we can focus a bit more of our time trying to rack up some money. The next piece of our slime puzzle is the Kimball Hazard, which will apply poison slime to every 7 pegs that we hit, and at the end of each turn, an enemy we target will take all of that damage. And thanks to the Round Guard, whenever we reload, that poison slime damage can go off a total of 3 times. And even though our build seems strong enough and is probably one of the strongest I have had this early on in Crucible 20, I still need to focus on fighting elites in order to get relics, even though I could very easily lose. But with only 25 health, and thanks to my Kimball Hazard now being level 3 and applying poison on every 3 pegs hit instead of every 7, we are able to beat an elite without losing any additional health, which rewards us with the Ring of Pain, which makes it so that every time we lose health, we will deal 7 times that to all of our enemies, which can be extremely strong since we are definitely going to be losing a lot of health. And with all of our relics and slime orb, we might actually have a chance of defeating Leshy. With the combination of the Kimaball orb, the pumpkin pie, which can send an orb from the bottom of the board to the top, and the slime relic, our first throw set up a massive amount of poison damage. And luckily, since we were able to get it off before any vines showed up, allow us to actually beat Leshy. Typically, if we aren't able to deal a ton of damage or set up a ton of damage with the first 2 or 3 turns, the vines of Leshy will always overpower us. But luckily we made it through, and this is the 3rd run that I have ever gotten past the forest with in Crucible 20. And with the hardest boss already behind us, I have very high hopes for this attempt. One thing that I have failed to mention before is that after defeating a boss, we are always given an option of a boss relic, which are relics that are supposed to be some of the strongest in the game, and they can only be obtained 2 times during a run, once from the forest boss and the second from the castle boss. And while they're supposed to be the strongest in the game, some aren't really that good at all. But luckily for us, we were able to get the gift relic, which makes it so that all of our pegs have durable, which means that they won't break until they're hit a total of 3 times, which with us already having some slime orbs, makes for a really good combo. And for some certain fights like the elite in the castle, this combo is performing exactly how we want it to. We were also able to get a healing slime earlier in the castle, which is also going to be very crucial, as many fights later on will deal a lot of damage to us, making healing an absolute necessity. And since the mini wall fight was so easy for us, we were able to keep all of our health, as well as gain a very needed relic in the rainbow leaf, which will help us gain max health for every enemy that we defeat. While making our way towards the Ballista boss, we were able to get our beloved Prime Slime, which instead of relying on our Healing Slime and Poison Slime orb, it just turns all of our orbs into slime orbs, making every 17th peg hit turn into a random slime, with the main ones that we want just being more ways to heal, as well as more ways to deal poison damage. We also found ourselves a cookie at the shop, which can allow us to heal up even more and set ourselves up very nicely to deal with the Ballista, as well as another relic which will give us a 10% chance to dodge any attack for any enemy that spawns. And thanks to the Ballista having 15 minions that it spawns, we'll hopefully be able to dodge most of the Ballista's massive attacks, as well as heal up any of the times it manages to damage us. I also mentioned that in Crucible 20, each boss has its own special ability that makes it more difficult, and in this one, the Ballista minions move twice as fast. So if we aren't able to take the minions out, we will take damage much faster. But thanks to our ever-increasing amount of slime, these minions don't prove to be all that powerful. We also were able to get the achievement to destroy all of the Ballista's minions thanks to them moving so quickly. We gained the boss relic Kinetic Meteorite, which makes it where every 3rd peg hit, our orb will gain explosive force, which when combined with the durable pegs from the gift, can start flying around very fast. At this point, our largest threat in the mines is taking a ton of damage all at once. We have the healing to sustain any prolonged fight, but any opponents that have red bombs are very scary. In an encounter, we are given the option to gain the Ingot, which will half our max health, but give us a relic that will heal us for every 5th peg hit, which is normally extremely strong, but also would make us much more likely to lose against the red bombs. So since we already have decent enough healing, we have to opt against taking the Ingot, which normally is always worth taking, and as fate would have it, we immediately go up against some red bombs and take a total of 93 damage, which if we did not get the leaf to increase our maximum health, the cookie and healing slimes to heal up extra health, or if we had taken the Ingot to half our total health, we would have immediately lost. In the next fight, we were already fairly low from the previous one, but thanks to the docked orb that we grabbed along the way, we were able to heal all the way back to full and set ourselves up very nicely for the final boss. The final boss we have to face up against in this run of Crucible 20 is the Super Sapper, which can deal a lot of damage with bombs and is going to rely very heavily on us being able to heal as much as possible. And since we have a very good orb at setting up a lot of healing slimes, we can throw it and set up our board for the rest of the fight, which ends up just getting us 2 healing orbs. Even though the healing slime completely failed us, thanks to our massive amount of health, the random slimes that get applied by Prime Slime, and the Poison Slime to do a lot of damage, our build is just perfect enough to sustain against the Super Sapper. And with the addition of Crucible 20, the unique modifier that the Super Sapper has is that after a certain threshold of health, it will continuously rebuild its Minesweeper board, making it harder to hit all of our slimed up pegs. And even though the Super Sapper summons loads and loads of enemies, we have just enough to finally take it down, which gains us the illustrious achievement for beating Crucible 20, which as far as anyone is concerned, is the first time anyone has ever gotten this. But Peglin is still not complete. After beating the hardest achievement in Peglin, there were still a few achievements left to do that I still needed to get. The first one was to use the Spinventor to fully assemble the Ball, which is an orb unique to this class, where 5 pieces of the orb can be given at any point, and as each one of them is bought, they will combine together, and once all 5 pieces are bought, will create the Ball. We then had to get an enemy brambled for at least 6 turns, which can only be done by buying a Bramble and using it to apply Bramble, which will just hold the opponent in place. And also in the same vein, we had to get at least 3 Bramballs stuck in Leshy's vines at the same time. And as we have been trying to win all the runs all this time, the very last achievement we had to obtain was to die during an event scenario. And by reducing our health to 1 at the end of a fight, by finding an encounter that could lower our health, we took the damage and we gained our final achievement. And that is how I became the very first person to 100% Peglin, according to Steam. Just don't go and try and fact check me.